So if we're being honest tonight, we are looking at one of the scariest lies out of our 4 lies that we're looking at. We are looking at one of the scariest, if not the scariest one out of those 4 to overcome tonight. We're looking at the lie that vulnerability is a weakness. Vulnerability is a weakness. Now that's a lie. But it's scary to think that vulnerability is a weakness and to try and combat that lie. It's actually scary because there is a cost to vulnerability. I need to acknowledge that right from the start. I'm not saying that vulnerability is easy and it's a walk in the park, but what I'm saying is the lie that we're fed is that we're told that vulnerability is a weakness. Vulnerability is so far from a weakness. When we actually understand what true vulnerability looks like, it is so far from a weakness. Vulnerability done right glues people together and it pulls them out of their own darkness. Brene Brown says this. She says, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage are always uncomfortable, but they're never a weakness. You know, I've had moments in my life where I've had these snippets of what it feels like to, just live in a vulnerable environment. When I was growing up, as you all know, if you've been here before, you would have heard me say that I lived in a town called Seymour. It was a small little country town with a big whopping mass of 6,800 people all up. We got a McDonald's when I was 15. That was pretty cool. But in that school, in that community, it was just kind of like this little town that nothing ever really happened. And in grade 7, one of our classmates actually got really, really sick and then passed away from an illness. And up until that point in our community, it was just kind of like the worst thing that happened was, the Seymour Football Club lost the footy and, we're all sad about that. But then in this moment, we were faced with something. And I remember what it was like when our friend had passed away. We were all grieving the loss of this life, and we all didn't know where to turn. But the most beautiful thing happened out of this was that in our classroom, we learned that it was okay to not be okay. I remember sitting in class, and it was like, someone's head would go down, and then they would just start crying. And it was like that might have been the biggest loser in our school. But in that moment, it didn't matter about your social status because someone would come and comfort them. It didn't matter whether they were cool, whether they were a loser, whether they were tall, whether they were short. It did not matter where they fitted in any social hierarchy. In that classroom, after our friend passed away, there was something beautiful. It was okay to not be okay. We lived in a state of vulnerability. It was beautiful. And I'm 29 years old and I still talk so fondly of what this was like as a 13-year-old boy having this classroom that was filled with vulnerability. Can you just imagine what that would be like, being in a classroom with the coolest person and someone who everyone hated, but all of that just disappeared because when we were vulnerable before each other, it was okay to not be okay. But I remember the moment that vulnerability was gone. I remember we had new people come into our classroom, and all of a sudden the appeal or the desire to get vulnerable, it was outweighed by the doubt in our hearts and our minds. And that vulnerability in that classroom, in that environment was gone. I want to ask you tonight, where in your life have you experienced vulnerability? Now, it may not be in that kind of a circumstance, but where has there been a moment in your life where you have experienced vulnerability? Maybe for some of you, it was when you were having a D&M at a party or a sleepover, and there was just this moment where, you actually felt like for the first time you could share your real emotions with your friend. That conversation just kept going on and on and on, and it just felt right. Maybe the moment where you felt vulnerable for the first time was you were listening to a song, and as that song was getting sung to you or you heard it, you found yourself going, wow, I feel like these lyrics are written for me. I actually feel understood. You may have been in an environment where you were scared to ask a question, where you didn't quite understand something, and there was this moment where you put your hand up and you said, I'm not sure, can you help me understand this? You're actually vulnerable enough to say, hey, I'm not sure I'm following with what's going on here. Can you help me out? You know, the vulnerability that you have experienced, it may have been when you're on a missions trip, when you're on a camp. It might have been on one of our camps. It might have been here in one of our small groups here at New Life Youth. But it's a moment in your life. Vulnerability is a moment or a time in your life where you feel safe. And then just like that, the enemy comes. And the enemy begins to lie to us. Steals this moment away from us. Robs us of what this moment could be. Begins to lie to us and say that vulnerability is a weakness. The enemy says, hey, if you don't feel safe, I wouldn't be sharing those emotions with you because I wouldn't trust that person. What happens if they turn around and laugh at you? What happens if they tell the whole school what's going on in your heart? The enemy says, no one understands you, so don't even begin to ask the questions about, can I get help? Because no one understands you. Don't be vulnerable. That's a sign of weakness. We get told that, if the glue that held us together, if that cracks and something spills, and that's a weakness. We get told that don't even rely on the glue in the first place. Vulnerability is a weakness. We get told as men, as boys, we get told real men don't cry. That is the biggest lie. We get told if I cry, then people are going to think I'm weak. What happens if they see me as weak? And then all of a sudden we clam up. People begin to put on masks. Physical masks, the way that they dress, the way that they do their face. They begin to put on masks and they say, no one can see the real me. Because I think if someone sees who the real me is, then they are not going to like it. In fact, they're going to be repulsed by it. And that is an enemy that we get told. We get told that vulnerability is a weakness. And if we choose to believe that lie, New Life Youth, if you choose to believe that lie for your life will be a series of walls that you have built up in front of people. It will be a lifetime of shallow relationships, and it will be a crippling fear of the unknown. It will be a crippling fear of the what if they say something? What if? As I said, vulnerability is not easy. Vulnerability is not easy. It's hard. And tonight, my hope and my prayer is that we can begin to undo what for some in this room might feel like a lifetime of lies that the enemy has fed you. My hope and my prayer is that tonight we begin to undo, just slowly, bit by bit, we begin to undo the lies that the enemy has told us. And we begin to believe in a proven, life-giving alternative that can only be found in one place. True vulnerability can only be found in one place. True safety can only be found in one place. I've read about it. I've prayed about it. I've felt it. My hope and my prayer is that anyone who's come into this building tonight, anyone who is struggling with the idea of being vulnerable, anyone who has begun to believe the lie that vulnerability is a weakness, my hope and my prayer is that tonight you experience a true and authentic moment with Jesus where you learn that vulnerability is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So anyone in here who is craving real relationships, real authentic vulnerability, then the best place that we can turn is God's word. Because if we're going to find out about God, then the best place to do that is to read his word. And so if you've ever read any of the Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you'll know that there's a group of people called the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were kind of like your Eddie the experts. They were kind of like your straight-A students with a bit of a twist. The Pharisees were actually quite arrogant. They were pride-filled. And for the most part, the Pharisees found themselves unwilling to change on their opinions. So much so that these Pharisees were so convinced of what they truly believed that they didn't even see God right in front of them. In fact, they spent most of their time arguing with Jesus, who was God on earth. So these people who said that they believed it, and they were so stubborn, so arrogant, so pride-filled that they were like, no, this isn't the real thing because we know what the real thing is. So what happens? We'll talk about vulnerability. What happens if one of these Pharisees actually comes vulnerably before Jesus? How do you think Jesus would respond in a moment where these people who spend their days trying to knock him down, trying to silence his ministry, trying to kick him out of all the places where people are seeking the truth, how do you think Jesus would respond to a Pharisee? Well, in John 3, we read about this guy, his name's Nicodemus. And this is a really, really cool story. Nicodemus, it says this, John 3, 1-2, it says, there was a man named Nicodemus. He was a Jewish religious leader who was a Pharisee. And then it says this, after dark one evening, he came to speak with Jesus. Now we've got to ask ourselves the question, why would they put the word dark in there? Why would they say that a Pharisee after dark has come to speak to Jesus? Well, we're actually getting a bit of a clue about this. We're getting an insight into what kind of a person Nicodemus felt like he was, or what was at stake for Nicodemus. You see, he went at nighttime because back in those days, they didn't have bright torches or LED bars or, even phone torches. When you were doing something in the dark, it was because you didn't want to be seen. And so there was something about this guy named Nicodemus who he was embarrassed. There was something in him that said, if I get this wrong, if I get caught out by my friends that I'm going and asking this guy Jesus questions, I'm done. So he did it in the silence. He did it in the secrecy. And then it says that he met with Jesus. One evening after dark, he came to speak with Jesus. It was because he was ashamed. He was scared. He was worried. But there was something in him that said the vulnerability is worth it. And so he went to Jesus and he began to ask these questions. He began to say to Jesus, what do you mean? As he heard Jesus speak, he was saying, what do you mean by this? He wasn't saying it in an attacking way. He was genuinely curious. Nicodemus wanted to know what Jesus was talking about. He would say, how can that happen, Jesus? I don't get this. He humbly came before God. He got vulnerable before God and he said, how are these things even possible? Now, for us to think this through, we need to understand that these Pharisees, as I said, they spent their life trying to school Jesus. And here is Jesus with a vulnerable Pharisee on the ropes, up against the wall. And instead, Jesus doesn't school him. Jesus doesn't embarrass him, but Jesus walks with him through his insecurities. Jesus leads him through his vulnerability and he says, it is okay. So what can we learn from this story? What can we learn from a Pharisee? We can learn that our ego, our pride, our arrogance, our weakness are only going to prevent us from getting vulnerable with Jesus if we let it. Christians in the room, those of you who call yourselves a Christian, this is a confronting question. When has your qualification as a Christian got in the way of your vulnerability? So when has your qualification, thinking like a Pharisee, those moments where we think because we're a Christian, we don't need. Or, your actions have got in the way. When have your actions got in the way of you being vulnerable before God? When has your stance, when has your ego, when has your weakness got in the way of your vulnerability? That is a confronting question for those of us who call ourselves Christians to ask. But the story of Nicodemus shouldn't be one that scares us. In fact, the story of Nicodemus should be one that encourages us, that inspires us, that says it does not matter how inflated your ego is. It doesn't matter how pride-filled you are, how right you thought you were. But if you actually come before Jesus and you say, hey, I don't understand. Hey, I'm sorry. If you get vulnerable, then you are not going to get met with this person that's like, haha, I told you so. But you get met with a loving embrace and a gentle guidance. That we can actually come, just think this through. Even those of us who are the most pride-filled people in this room, we can actually come before God, get vulnerable before God. Say, what do you mean? How can that happen? I don't get it. I don't understand. I love it because when we come before God with those questions, even those us who think, we know all the VeggieTales stories, we know everything, we've memorized them all. If we come before God, vulnerably come before God, we aren't mocked, we're not laughed at, we're not rejected. We are met right where we are. God meets us in that vulnerability. God is delighted when we drop the act and get vulnerable before Him. Whoops, I just knocked my notes. That was bad. So God is delighted when we drop the act and get vulnerable before Him. I've been doing this. I've been a youth pastor now for 6 years, which basically makes me a dinosaur, right? Seriously, it does. I actually think, does that mean that no one was in grade 7 when I started? I'm not very good at maths, but I'm assuming that means, yeah. So anyways, that's just a little reflection thing. Focus, Jason. So I've been a youth pastor now for 6 years. And it's interesting because over those 6 years, I've learned a thing or two on how to run youth. I've learned some things, some do's and some don'ts. And, sometimes in myself, if I'm being vulnerable tonight, I myself can be a little pride-filled in how I think things need to be done. Sometimes I actually convince myself that the way that I want to do it is definitely the right way. I think that, I've got it all under control. This all falls on me. I'm the one. And then along comes this lovely thing called coronavirus, which means that we can no longer meet face to face. And so everything that I myself had begun to rely on, that I told myself, hey, you've got this, Jason. You're a superstar. I didn't ever say that about myself. Exaggeration. But as I began to convince myself, hey, it's okay, then this comes along. And what I found was there was this wrestle in me. That as it felt like things were getting pulled away from me, I wanted to grab onto them tighter and tighter and tighter. I was trying to work out, how do I do these programs? How do we make New Life Youth Online work, which, I still don't think we did very well at? How do we make youth work when it's COVID safe and we can't be more than 1 kilometer near each other? Like all of these questions I began to ask myself. And it was interesting because here was me thinking that I've got this. And then what I realized was as I begun to hand these things over to God, as I came vulnerably before God and I said, God, you know what? I don't know how this works. I do not understand this at all. And so I actually began to come before God and say, hey, God, I need your help. I can't do this on my own. And this amazing thing happened. The more I came vulnerably before God in this season, the more I opened up my hands. Do you know what happened? The more at peace I felt about everything, the more I saw God begin to work in my own life, in the life of those people around us, in our youth ministry. And so for me, this season has been a reminder that vulnerability is not a weakness. For me, this season has been a reminder that vulnerability is actually a strength. When I'm vulnerable before the Creator, it creates something incredible. When we as Christians put our egos aside and begin to put our pride to the side and we come humbly before God, some amazing things happen. So Christians in the room, I'm going to ask you that question again. When has your qualification, when has your title as a Christian got in the way of your vulnerability between you and God? There's another story in the Bible. When I was looking at stories of people being vulnerable in the scriptures, it just felt like story after story after story of all these people being vulnerable before God. And it was amazing because as you read these stories, God remained true to His word. God remained true to His people. God loved His people. And we heard that story before get read out about these two different women who were healed. One who had died, a 12-year-old girl who had died, and then another lady. And I want to focus on those 3 verses for a little bit out of Matthew 9, 20 to 22. It says this.
Jesus heals in response to faith.
Yeah, sick. Technology. It says this. I was actually going to have an attempt to write that. No, it says this. Just then, a woman who had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding came up behind him. She touched the fringe of Jesus' robe, for she thought, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, daughter, be encouraged. Your faith has made you well. And the woman was healed at that moment. Now, we can read that story. In fact, for a lot of us in this room, we've heard that story time and time again. But as I sat in this story this week, and I looked at what vulnerability looked like, I genuinely cannot imagine what it took for that lady to be so vulnerable in that moment. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being nothing in society? Can you imagine not even having a name? Can you imagine because of a medical difficulty, because of a title, because of a label, because of something that you did, can you imagine not even being given a name? Can you imagine people looking around you forever, looking right through you? It's like you're invisible. Because that was the story for this woman. For 12 years, she was an outcast. She was pushed to the side. She was a nothing. She didn't even have a name. I cannot imagine what it took for this lady to be so vulnerable before Jesus. In the eyes of the world, this woman had nothing. In the eyes of the world, this woman had nothing. But when she met Jesus, she gained everything she ever needed. She encountered Jesus. She met Jesus. She was healed. And then she was given an identity. Jesus called this woman daughter. It doesn't say in the scripture when the last time was that lady was called daughter. But I can imagine due to her medical condition that had been a very long time. This woman, this daughter of God, refused to believe the lies of the enemy. She refused to believe that vulnerability is a weakness. This woman knew, Nicodemus knew, that vulnerability was going to be the thing that set them free. For them to be vulnerable in the right moment. To actually hand whatever it is over, the labels, the not labels, the pride, the ego. The fact that you've been overlooked for your whole life, for you to come vulnerably before Jesus and say, I need you. This is who I am. As I said, that woman, she encountered Jesus. Nicodemus encountered the grace and the love of Jesus. What's it going to take? What's it going to take for you to be vulnerable before Jesus? What's it going to take for you to say, hey, I'm no longer going to believe the lie that the enemy tells me that vulnerability is weakness? Because I know that vulnerability is actually a strength. When I'm vulnerable before Jesus, wow, God can do a work. What's it going to take for you to be vulnerable before Jesus? Do you really want to be set free from these walls that you've built up? Do you want to be set free from the shallow relationships, from the fear that you have that says, I can't trust anyone? Do you want to be set free from that? Because Jesus is the only way that we can truly be set free from those things. So when we come vulnerably before Jesus, we are rewarded with relationship. Let's pray.
Thanks so much for watching. We hope this message encouraged you. If you have any prayer requests, please let us know. Our contact information is in the description down below. Make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, and share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. We'll see you next time. All right, who's next?